we have one more speaker before we go to lunch, and that is Katie Wright. She's the CEO and the managing partner of the Engine, a venture capital fund built by MIT to support their early stage climate innovations. Katie.
Thank you so much for having me. And I think I'm going to share my screen if that works for you. We are a fund that spun out of MIT, kind of a very unusual entity. And I'm going to talk about why these kind of entities need to exist and what they can do in order to move our climate goals along. But I would also posit our most important problems along that have technological solutions. So I'm going to tell a little bit of story about what we do and the kinds of things we back, but what it takes to back companies like this coming out of academic labs. 2015, Raphael Reif, our president at MIT, basically said, hey, we need a new way to support and fund very important, tough technologies, things that work on our biggest problems. And climate is dead center to that, right? Often all the solutions come out of academic labs, working in physical spaces. It's new power plants, new ways to generate electricity, new ways to power industry. And venture capital in that space was broken and had to reinvent itself. And so could we reinvent ourselves in this space was the question. The answer to it, we thought, was you must be very close to some of the most dense networks of knowledge and understanding about how to reshape or reform almost everything that we produce. And that requires smart people, capital, and dense networks, and collaboration often with the government. So that was really what the Engine was set up to do. And the real reason that it was set up to do this is in tough tech or in climate tech, there's not just one valley of death. There are many, but the first one is a really, really important one. And it's that R&D, invention and lab, does not translate. And often it's because the time frame to market is too long, and that scares away early stage investors. So the question we put out there was to the investment world, if our time frames were slightly longer, but our outcomes were more important and created bigger companies with bigger impact, is that worth funding? And the answer from the investment community was, if you pick the right companies and they could be big enough, it was a resounding yes. And so when the Engine formed, that's what we started to do. But as soon as you begin to do this translational phase investment, you have to worry about all the valleys of death after that. And that requires formation of all different forms of capital and governmental support to make sure that that happens. But I would say this is imperative that we, as not just a nation, but a world, figure out how to do that. Because, and you guys are going to talk about this tomorrow, if we're going to hit our climate goals, we must not just do it, we must be excellent at it, so that more and more solutions can come not just to market, but to scale, to global scale. So that if a company that could take out 3% of carbon in the world because they transform an industrial process could actually scale globally and really start to get at maybe 1% or 2% over 10 years. If you have a bunch of those happening, great things will come of it for the world on the climate front. So that's kind of what we're up to and what we're trying to create. And we're not doing this alone. This is in collaboration with many other venture capital funds, with the US government, and globally. This isn't just something that happens in the US, right? Many partnerships happen in other parts of the world. We're early. We have 44 portfolio companies. They've raised now over $3.5 billion. So it's not, we are 5 years into this. So it's not that this is something we're just starting. this is happening. These companies are building momentum and building density. And I think a lesson that I'll just point out, because a lot of people come to visit us, is like, anybody who wants to try to do this, you must create a dense community of entrepreneurs going after these big problems so that they can work together. So there's a workforce that can be produced that knows how to build companies like this. We think climate change is a very important area, but you cannot separate it from two other areas. That's advanced systems. So having compute power and ways to move goods in the world is completely connected to climate change, and climate change is completely connected to human health and human health systems. I used to say this to people and they thought I was a little nutty when I said it, but then COVID hit. COVID and these types of diseases that spread are absolutely linked to climate change and globalization. And so we look at these three areas as interconnected ways to make the world a more resilient and sustainable place. If you look at the top 20 venture capital deals that were climate related, you will see that a lot of money is going towards private US companies between 2018 and 2020. That's massively important, but it is only the beginning of what we need to do. And you'll see these companies are really focused in 2 or 3 areas of the world, right? Massachusetts and California are where most of these companies are coming from. There are outliers there, and I'd love to see it, right? You see things coming out of Washington, the state of Washington, you see things coming out of Florida, Kentucky, but we need more dense ecosystems like exist in California and Massachusetts. That is imperative to the change that we need to have come about. I would say a couple of things that we think are imperative to making investments in this space work. One is the analytic capabilities, basically being able to show with bits and bytes, so with compute power, how these things will work and to prove out their techno-economics. I think that work is coming fast and furiously, and it makes these companies much more fundable. And then you have to look at how do you create exits and what are the fundamentals upon which companies are valued, and how do you get them to the public markets in a sustainable way. So we've seen, the rise and fall of the SPAC, but working on how to exit these climate companies in a way that returns value over time, I think is also fundamental to reducing carbon in the world. You'll see, and this is really important, it's $80 billion has gone to climate tech in the last few years. That's over 4,200 deals. So a huge number of deals have come around. And so we have a lot of shots on goal. My personal opinion is that there will be a small number of outlier winners, and that they will get piled in on, and most of the value will be created by just a few of those companies. I hate to say it, but it is how venture capital works. So those, and especially in down markets, you see this happen, is like there is a flight to quality and a flight to the companies that are going to make it work. So I think it's incumbent on everyone to be very careful about what do they invest in and make sure that the technology is really there, so they have a shot at being an outlier winner. One of the interesting things that's happened, if you look at the data, is that so much of this clean tech dollars have gone into the EV vehicle markets, about 50%. that's a huge concentration in a very, in an important area, but only one area. I think the cool thing in 2021, while the automotive sector went down, others went up, right? Battery storage, energy storage became a real thing and an important thing. It's the way you're going to get more wind and solar online. Aviation became more important. We know there's a lot of CO2 emitted in aviation. And then also power generation. So we love to see that there is more diversity in the kinds of companies that are going out, and it should give hope to those people innovating in different areas that their startups can be funded. So I think actually, despite it not being great news for automotive, it is good news for the rest of the clean tech industries that also need capital to get there. If you look at where capital goes, of course, in any market like this, late stage is where most of the capital goes because it's in proven technologies that can scale, and they need much more money to scale. I think the great news about what's happening, though, is we're not underfunding the early stage, so that we will have more shots on goal and more things that could actually make an impact in reversing climate change or mitigating climate change. So I think that is good news. And I hope that this bar chart continues to look like that, even in an economic downturn. I'm not going to go into the IPO markets. I don't think we have enough time to do that. I'm going to go into a few of the companies. So one of the things that I think is fundamental to what is happening right now is that the world is backing some super important companies that could really fundamentally shift how we power our world and how, and that's not just in the US. Could be a fundamental shift in how everybody generates electricity. Fusion has been a joke for many years that it's always 30 years away. I can tell you, I do not believe that is the case anymore. I think one of the exciting things for the US is that we now have another fusion program that is related to companies actually trying to bring fusion power online within this decade. And Commonwealth Fusion is an example, but my point here is that we must form venture funds that can last more than 10 years, because to be able to bet on things like this requires longer timeframes. And it may be that companies like this can exit to the public markets sooner. That would be amazing for everybody, but we have to have the fortitude to bet on really, really big things. And if we could have small fusion power plants all over the world powering a clean grid, that will make a significant difference, and it could happen in the next 20 years. And so we need to have the fortitude to back things like this. We also need to look at all the ways of decarbonizing our industries, right? This is kind of an unsexy topic, but a really important one. Every single one of our industries with a thermal process is expending a huge amount of energy to produce a good that we all use. So a company like Via Separations, they're looking at pulp and paper, but they could also look at chemical manufacturing, et cetera. If there was a way to use separation versus evaporation, you save an enormous amount of carbon. And these are the kinds of companies we have to have the fortitude to start and back and see scale. And I'll just give you one more example, Form Energy. So this is a group that is doing long duration, very inexpensive, long duration storage for wind and solar. This unlocks wind and solar to be able to power the grid. That is a super important thing to happen if we're going to bring alternative forms of energy online in the near term. So I'm going to pause there and move to questions because I know we don't have much time. So that's what the engine does. I think there needs to be many things like it across the country and the world so that more of these companies can make it to market.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. That was a great overview of the organization and some of the challenges that are there. We do have a few questions. So somebody was pointing out that that on your Valley of Death graph, the federal government is a key player listed across all of the different valleys of death. So at the different stages along the way, what is the role that the federal government plays to take how can they take a more proactive role in supporting all of those different spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different at each stage, right? In the beginning stages, it's money to do research so that we can have the breakthroughs in science and engineering, right? That's fairly straightforward. I think in the later stages, I think it is often procurement, it's loan guarantees, it is regulation. So making sure regulatory frameworks are clear so that investors know when they're making a bet on something that that framework can stick. And so I think it's in a whole bunch of different ways. And I think we are becoming more proactive there. But I think we have a little bit of a stuck mindset in federal funding that no venture can fail, right? That 100% of the loans have to work out. That's what happened in the Obama era with Solyndra, right? Oh, Solyndra failed, therefore the loan program was bad. We just have to get over that. In venture capital, you assume that at least a third of your investments aren't going to make it. And that's okay because a third will be outstanding and make a huge impact. And so you have to be okay with that kind of thinking, that kind of investor thinking.
Great. Okay. There's another question here is asking, how can an organization like yours, especially one that's so tied into the academic pipeline for these technologies, really drive the 1 to 2 orders of magnitude decrease in the funding, increase in funding to energy and heat generation required to drive the real change in these sectors? So, you're connected at a very specific point. How do you build on that?
Yeah, I think the point of what we do is to try to think really big and to try to support the entrepreneurs in thinking really big and not exiting early or not getting really small and thinking about like the tiny little thing that they could do, that we're always thinking about, hey, how does this company scale globally? What kind of capital do you need? What team do you need to scale globally? So I think it is that mindset of thinking globally and at a scaled level. That's how we're going to have impact.
I was struck when I was looking at when I was listening to your presentation that you talked about this phrase stuck with me, this sort of building a dense community of people that are all trying to solve these challenges. We obviously here at Caltech are trying to do the same thing with a relatively small campus, but plugged into the larger community here. At the same time, you're talking about trying to encourage the growth of these companies from all over the place. So how do you balance the need to try and build people together and try and pull them into these areas where there's already the density versus trying to build that out in more places?
It's a really tricky thing, but the way we try to strike that balance is build a very dense community in the Boston area, but also make sure that we are very open about what we're learning, invite people here, have an open system so that whatever we learn, we're willing to share. And we're also want other people to come here and say, hey, you know what? This is how it works here. And we think that's working better. So we're always open to learning and we're always open to sharing so that that open system of innovation will allow other communities to see ours and then innovate from there. We know other people are going to make it even better in their region. So it is that kind of open innovation that we think is really important. And it's why we have a summit every year. It's why we try to gather as many people and make as many friends across this industry as we can.
Yeah. That's great. Somebody posted a question here, I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds. So how might some of these early stage climate tech companies be affected by a possible recession in the near future?
Okay, so I've been through a few cycles. And I think that of course funding will get harder. That is what happens in many of these cycles. But I think for climate tech, I think one of the most important things to remember is we've had a world who've made goals about where we need to get to on climate change. There are so many willing partners that want to reduce carbon or mitigate how climate is going to affect people, that I think you should be looking very creatively at corporate partners, government partners, university partners, and of course, philanthropic and capital partners. So I think it is that richness of putting this puzzle together that will really create great companies. We've always thought that. We never thought there was going to be flush capital markets for climate companies. So we've been always thinking that way. And I think that just has to maintain through this downturn. But I think there are a lot of possibilities. And that's why dense communities matter, so that information can exchange hands, that people that want to continue to invest here know where to find companies and learn how to creatively finance them if need be.
So I noticed in your presentation, you talked a little bit about this sort of huge jump in investment from 2020 into 2021, but there was a not the same size change in the number of deals that were made, which implies that some of the deals were getting quite a bit bigger. Is there was there a particular trend that you saw that was driving sort of what was happening in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this flight to the winners, right? Where the winners start to really be able to get a lot of capital. And then they're kind of declared winners by the capital markets. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of people want to come into those deals. So they're able to raise a significant amount of money to scale up. Mm-hmm. And those are the types of companies that have world-class management teams, that have really defined markets and can point to who's going to buy their products, and that their technology works. And, you know, that's where investors, later stage investors, want to be. They also can understand how they would play in the public markets, and they can see a path to that. And so I think you're starting to see a number of companies that look like great enduring companies of the future. And therefore, of course, there's going to be a flight of capital there.
Great. Somebody asked a question about information sharing and the importance of sort of openness, especially as we're innovating in some pretty interesting new technology areas. How do you balance sort of the need to keep research progress proprietary for business purposes versus the need to be able to support some of these bigger goal, you know, be open to support the bigger climate goals? And are the companies that you incubate or work with through the engine, do you encourage them to be more open with the results that they're getting?
So I think it's a company by company decision. It's not, I'm an investor. That is not my decision. It is management's decision. But I think often the decision can be right to be quite open. Like, I'll give you an example, Commonwealth Fusion. They thought it was super important for the world's physicists to really see what they did in their first 20 Tesla magnet, that it wasn't in secret, that it was, that anybody could come and see it. And not anybody, but people schooled in the art of what they're doing. And I think that's an important balance to have. There are some things that need to be kept secret, right? That it's a trade secret, something that can't be patented. But I think even in those cases, you can talk about what you're doing and the change that you're going to see and who can adopt it. And you can talk about that to other entrepreneurs and teach while you're doing. And I think that kind of openness is what I mean. It's less intellectual property.
Mhm.
That's at the academic level. It's more how to build these companies, how to build what we call tough tech companies.
Great. All right. So one last question before we break here. What advice do you have for recently graduated PhDs or other academics who want to get into the clean tech or other hard tech VC area? The quote says, it seems like this space could use some more technical talent.
Definitely. I think one of the main things is that when you're betting on these kind of companies, you don't want to get burned by the technology. You want to really understand, what have they created? Where did that come from? So like in our firm, we hire a lot of very technical people. I think that's true across most clean tech VCs. I think the best way to really start to get to know is like, join a startup. You're going to start to get to know their investors, and that will bring you into this relatively small group, kind of family club of people who do this. It's not such a big world. And, we're always looking to meet young talent. And I think most people are very open to being helpful. So, we all try to do what we can. So make sure you reach out.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Katie. That was excellent overview and a look into some of the space we're looking at with the early stage startup community.